Hi guys! Welcome back to another deep dive into one of history's most haunting chapters. Tonight, we're exploring a topic that fundamentally changed the course of human civilization. A microscopic enemy that brought entire empires to their knees and reshaped society as we know it. We're talking about the plague, specifically the Black Death that swept across Europe, Asia, and North Africa in the 14th century. This isn't just a story about disease and mortality, but about how fear can transform communities, how desperation drives people to extraordinary measures, and how humanity somehow finds a way to persevere even in the darkest of times. We'll journey through medieval streets where the very air seemed poisoned, into homes where families watched helplessly as their loved ones succumbed to an enemy they couldn't see or understand. We'll explore the social upheaval, the religious questioning, the scapegoating, and the remarkable resilience that emerged from one of history's greatest catastrophes. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I really enjoy seeing where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. To truly understand why people feared the plague, we must first transport ourselves back to the medieval world of the 13th and early 14th centuries, a time when life was already precarious and uncertain. This was an era before modern medicine, before understanding of germs and bacteria, before antibiotics, or even basic sanitation as we know it today. People lived in a world where mysterious illnesses could strike without warning, where a simple cut could lead to infection and eventual demise, where childbirth was a gamble with mortality rates that would horrify us today. The average lifespan was barely 40 years, and infant mortality was so common that many parents didn't name their children until they survived their first year. In this context, when the plague arrived, it wasn't just another disease. It was the ultimate manifestation of every fear people already harbored about the fragility of human existence. The medieval understanding of disease was fundamentally different from our modern scientific perspective. People believed illness was caused by a combination of factors that seem almost quaint to us now, yet were taken with deadly seriousness then. The dominant theory was that of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which were thought to govern health when in balance and cause illness when disturbed. Physicians, such as they were, would examine a patient's urine color, check the alignment of the stars, and consider whether the patient had committed sins that might have brought divine punishment. There was also the widespread belief in miasma, the idea that bad air or noxious vapors rising from swamps, garbage, or decomposing matter could cause disease. When people saw the plague spreading rapidly through crowded cities, the miasma theory seemed to make perfect sense, which is why so many attempted to flee to the countryside, where the air was presumably cleaner and safer. The practice of medieval medicine was an elaborate ritual that combined elements of science, superstition, and religious faith in ways that would seem bizarre to modern observers. Physicians were required to undergo extensive training in the works of ancient authorities like Galen and Hippocrates, but this training was entirely theoretical and based on texts that were hundreds or even thousands of years old.
Medical students spent years memorizing complex charts that showed the relationship between planetary alignments and various diseases. Learning to calculate the most auspicious times for performing medical procedures based on the position of the stars and the phase of the moon.
The actual practice of diagnosis involved elaborate ceremonies that could take hours to complete. A physician examining a plague victim would first consult astrological charts to determine whether the patient's illness was caused by unfavorable planetary influences. He would then examine the patient's urine by holding a flask of it up to the light, checking its color, clarity, and sediment against detailed charts that supposedly revealed the state of the patient's internal humors. The physician might also taste the urine, as different flavors were thought to indicate different types of internal imbalance. Blood would be examined in similar fashion, with particular attention paid to its color and consistency. The treatment protocols that emerged from these elaborate diagnoses were often more harmful than helpful. Bloodletting was prescribed for almost every condition, based on the theory that most illnesses were caused by an excess of blood or corrupt blood that needed to be drained from the body. Physicians would use sharp instruments called lancets to open veins at specific locations that were thought to correspond to different organs. The amount of blood to be drawn was calculated according to complex formulas that took into account the patient's age, sex, astrological sign, and the current phase of the moon. Some patients were bled so extensively that they died from blood loss rather than from their original illness. Purging was another common treatment that involved giving patients powerful laxatives or emetics to force them to vomit or defecate, supposedly expelling corrupt humors from their bodies. These purgatives were often made from toxic substances like mercury, antimony, or various poisonous plants, and frequently caused severe dehydration and chemical poisoning. Patients who survived the purging process were often weaker than when they started, making them even more vulnerable to the plague or other infections. The wealthy could afford to consult multiple physicians and purchase expensive remedies that were imported from distant lands. Wealthy plague victims might be treated with ground pearls, powdered unicorn horn, or bezoar stones, which were concretions found in the stomachs of certain animals and believed to have magical healing properties. These exotic remedies were fantastically expensive, but completely useless against the plague. The irony was that poor people who couldn't afford any medical treatment at all often had better survival rates simply because they weren't being subjected to harmful medical interventions. The plague itself was a bacterial infection caused by Yersinia pestis, though this scientific understanding wouldn't come for another 500 years. The bacteria primarily lived in fleas that infested rats, and when infected rats died, the fleas would seek new hosts, including humans. There were actually 3 forms of plague that terrorized medieval populations. Bubonic plague was the most common, characterized by painful, swollen lymph nodes called buboes that could grow to the size of apples, typically appearing in the groin, armpit, or neck. These buboes were excruciatingly painful and would often burst, releasing pus and blood. Victims suffered from high fever, chills, headaches, and weakness. While bubonic plague had a mortality rate of about 60%, it wasn't the most feared form. The progression of bubonic plague followed a terrifying pattern that became all too familiar to medieval observers. The first sign was often a small, barely noticeable bump at the site where an infected flea had bitten. Within hours, this tiny bump would begin to swell rapidly, becoming hot, red, and extremely painful. The victim would develop a high fever, often accompanied by violent chills that would leave them shaking uncontrollably despite feeling as though they were burning up inside. The headaches associated with plague were described as being so severe that victims would beat their heads against walls or beg to be put out of their misery. As the disease progressed, additional buboes would appear at other lymph node sites throughout the body. The original bubo would continue to grow, sometimes reaching the size of a chicken egg or even larger. The skin over the bubo would become stretched and shiny, taking on a dark purplish color that many observers compared to a ripe plum. The pain was so intense that victims could not bear to have the affected area touched, and many found it impossible to move the associated limb without screaming in agony. The psychological effects of bubonic plague were almost as devastating as the physical symptoms. The combination of severe pain, high fever, and toxic effects from the bacterial infection would cause victims to become delirious and confused. They would see hallucinations, hear voices that weren't there, and become convinced that family members or caregivers were trying to harm them. Some victims would become violent in their delirium, lashing out at anyone who came near them. Others would fall into a stupor so deep that they appeared to be already dead, leading to horrible incidents where people were accidentally buried alive. The social implications of these psychological symptoms were profound. Families watching their loved ones descend into madness often interpreted the delirium as evidence that the victim was being possessed by demons or punished by God for hidden sins. This belief made it even more difficult for family members to provide care, as they feared that close contact with the victim might expose them to supernatural as well as physical dangers. Some families would abandon delirious plague victims, leaving them to die alone, rather than risk their own souls by remaining in contact with someone who seemed to be in the grip of evil forces. Pneumonic plague attacked the respiratory system and was almost universally fatal within days of infection. Victims would cough up blood, struggle for breath, and essentially drown in their own bodily fluids. What made pneumonic plague particularly terrifying was that it could spread directly from person to person through respiratory droplets, meaning that simply being near an infected individual could spell certain doom. The third form, septicemic plague, occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, causing rapid organ failure and almost certain demise within hours. Victims of septicemic plague would develop dark patches on their skin as blood vessels hemorrhaged, giving them a ghastly appearance that added to the supernatural terror surrounding the disease. The experience of witnessing someone die from pneumonic plague was particularly haunting for medieval observers. The victim would initially develop what seemed like a common cold or mild fever, symptoms so ordinary that family members might not even be concerned. Within a day or two, however, the cough would become more severe, and the victim would begin producing small amounts of blood-tinged sputum. This bloody sputum was one of the most feared signs of plague, as people had learned to associate it with almost certain death. As pneumonic plague progressed, the victims' breathing would become increasingly labored and painful. They would gasp for air, their chest heaving with the effort to draw breath into lungs that were rapidly filling with fluid and blood. The sound of their breathing would become wet and rattling, audible from across the room. Family members watching this struggle often described it as watching someone slowly drown on dry land, helpless to do anything to save them. The final stages of pneumonic plague were mercifully brief, but absolutely terrifying to witness. The victim would begin coughing up large quantities of bright red, frothy blood, sometimes so much that it would pour from their mouth and nose in torrents. Their skin would take on a bluish tinge as their blood became starved of oxygen, and they would often fall into convulsions before finally succumbing. The entire process from first symptoms to death typically took only 3 to 5 days, but those days seemed like an eternity to both victims and their families. What made pneumonic plague even more terrifying was its highly contagious nature. Unlike bubonic plague, which required the bite of an infected flea, pneumonic plague could be transmitted simply by breathing the same air as an infected person. This meant that caring for a family member with pneumonic plague was essentially a suicide mission. Many people who contracted pneumonic plague had done nothing more than sit by a sick relative's bedside or help them drink water. The disease's ability to spread through casual contact meant that entire households could be wiped out within a week or two of the first case appearing. The social consequences of pneumonic plague's contagious nature were devastating. Communities that had managed to maintain some semblance of caring for bubonic plague victims often completely abandoned those suffering from the respiratory form. Pneumonic plague victims were sometimes locked in their houses and left to die alone, with food and water left outside their doors by terrified neighbors who would not risk direct contact. In some cases, entire buildings suspected of housing pneumonic plague victims were boarded up or even burned down with the occupants still inside, as communities desperately tried to prevent the spread of the infection. The plague's arrival in Europe wasn't sudden, but rather followed the ancient trade routes that connected the known world. It likely originated in Central Asia, possibly in the region that is now Mongolia or Kazakhstan, where it existed in wild rodent populations. As trade along the Silk Road intensified in the 13th century, the plague began its inexorable journey westward. It reached the Crimean Peninsula by the 1340s, where it devastated the trading city of Kaffa, now known as Feodosia. From there, it spread rapidly throughout the Mediterranean world, carried by ships whose crews were often dead or dying by the time they reached port. The story of how plague reached Europe is intertwined with the complex political and military conflicts of the 14th century. The Mongol Golden Horde had been besieging the Genoese trading post at Kaffa for several years, trying to drive out the Italian merchants who controlled much of the Black Sea trade. When plague broke out among the Mongol forces in 1346, their military campaign seemed doomed to failure. However, the Mongol commanders devised a horrifying new form of biological warfare that would have consequences far beyond their original military objectives. According to contemporary accounts, The Mongols began using catapults to hurl the corpses of plague victims over the walls of Kaffa, deliberately trying to spread the disease among the defenders. This may have been one of the first recorded instances of biological warfare in human history, and it was devastatingly effective. Within weeks, plague had broken out inside the city, and the Genoese merchants were forced to abandon their trading post and flee by ship back toward Western Europe. The fleeing merchants carried more than just their personal possessions and trade goods. They also carried infected fleas in their clothing and supplies, and possibly infected crew members who had not yet shown symptoms. As these ships made their way through the Mediterranean, stopping at ports in Constantinople, Sicily, Genoa, and other major trading centers, they left a trail of infection that would soon engulf the entire continent. The irony was that the very trade networks that had brought prosperity and cultural exchange to medieval Europe now became the highways for the most devastating epidemic in human history. The speed with which plague spread along these trade routes was breathtaking and demonstrated just how interconnected the medieval world had become by the 14th century. A disease that began in the remote steppes of Central Asia could reach the major cities of Western Europe within a matter of months, carried by merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, and other travelers who had no idea they were serving as vectors for a deadly pathogen. This global interconnectedness, which had seemed like such a blessing during times of peace and prosperity, now revealed its dark side as diseases could spread across vast distances with unprecedented speed. One of the most haunting accounts from this period describes the arrival of plague ships in various European harbors. Sailors would sometimes tie themselves to the ship's wheel in their final moments, hoping to guide their vessel to safety even as they succumbed to the disease. Port authorities in some cities began to recognize these ghost ships and would attempt to prevent them from docking. But often it was too late. The rats carrying infected fleas had already scurried ashore, or surviving crew members had already made contact with the local population. The speed with which the plague could devastate a port city was breathtaking and terrifying. Sometimes entire neighborhoods would be wiped out within weeks of the first reported case. The maritime spread of plague created some of the most dramatic and terrifying scenes of the entire epidemic. Ships would arrive in harbor with their decks littered with corpses, their sails hanging in tatters, and only one or two crew members still alive to tell the tale of their voyage. These survivors were often in the final stages of plague themselves, delirious with fever and barely able to explain what had happened to their shipmates. Port officials who boarded these vessels would find holds full of rotting cargo, contaminated with the blood and bodily fluids of crew members who had died during the voyage. The psychological impact on harbor communities of witnessing these ghost ships was profound. Dock workers and port officials who had previously welcomed the arrival of merchant vessels as sources of trade and prosperity now viewed every approaching ship with terror and suspicion. Some ports established lookout points where officials would scan the horizon with crude telescopes, trying to determine whether approaching ships showed signs of plague infection before they could dock. Ships that flew distress signals or showed other signs of trouble were sometimes prevented from entering harbor at all, left to drift along the coast until their crews died or recovered. The attempts to quarantine infected ships often led to tragic and desperate scenes. Crew members who were still healthy would sometimes swim to shore rather than remain on infected vessels, spreading the disease to coastal communities. Others would attempt to conceal symptoms of plague in order to be allowed to dock, only to collapse and die once they reached land. Some ships were deliberately sunk by port authorities who feared that allowing them to dock would doom their entire city, condemning any survivors to drowning rather than risking plague transmission. The rats that infested these merchant vessels played a crucial role in spreading plague to European ports, though their importance wasn't understood at the time. Medieval people noticed that rats seemed to be dying in large numbers during plague outbreaks, but they interpreted this as another sign of divine displeasure rather than as a clue to the disease's transmission mechanism. Ship rats were particularly effective plague vectors because they could easily scurry ashore when vessels docked, carrying their infected fleas into warehouse districts, markets, and residential areas, where they would quickly establish new colonies and spread the infection to local rat populations. The cargo carried by infected ships also served as a vehicle for plague transmission in ways that wouldn't be understood for centuries. Cloth goods, grain shipments, and other organic materials provided ideal hiding places for infected fleas, which could survive for weeks or even months without feeding. When these goods were unloaded and distributed to merchants throughout a city, they carried plague infection into areas that might otherwise have remained safe. This explains why plague often seemed to appear simultaneously in multiple neighborhoods of a city, rather than spreading gradually outward from the port district. The plague reached Sicily in 1347, and from there it spread like wildfire throughout Europe. By 1348, it had reached mainland Italy, France, Spain, and England. By 1349, it had spread to Germany, Austria, and the Low Countries. By 1350, it had reached Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. No region seemed safe. No social class was immune. The plague struck indiscriminately, taking peasants and nobles, priests and merchants, adults and children with equal ferocity. This democratic nature of the disease was perhaps one of the most unsettling aspects for medieval people, who were accustomed to a world where social hierarchy provided some measure of protection and privilege. The pattern of plague spread across Europe revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of medieval civilization. Cities with the best trade connections and the most prosperous economies were often hit first and hardest, as their very success made them primary nodes in the networks that carried infection. Venice, Genoa, Florence, Paris, London, and other major commercial centers experienced some of the highest mortality rates, precisely because they were the most cosmopolitan and well-connected places in medieval Europe. Rural areas initially seemed to offer some protection from the plague, and many wealthy families fled from cities to their country estates in hopes of escaping infection. However, this strategy often proved futile, as fleeing city dwellers brought the plague with them to previously unaffected rural areas. Peasant communities that had remained isolated and healthy suddenly found themselves facing epidemic disease when lords and their retinues arrived from infected cities, carrying plague fleas in their clothing and possessions. The seasonal patterns of plague transmission also became a source of terror for medieval populations. People observed that plague seemed to worsen during warm weather and abate somewhat during winter months, though they had no understanding of why this might occur. In reality, flea populations were more active during warmer weather, making disease transmission more likely, but medieval people interpreted these seasonal patterns through the lens of their existing beliefs about astrology, divine punishment, and natural philosophy. The geographic spread of plague was highly uneven, creating a patchwork of devastated and relatively unaffected areas that added to the general sense of unpredictability and terror. Some cities lost half their population or more, while others suffered much lighter casualties for reasons that seemed completely random to contemporary observers. This uneven distribution made it impossible for people to predict whether their own communities would be severely affected or might somehow escape the worst effects of the epidemic. The plague's movement across Europe also followed river valleys, mountain passes, and other natural transportation corridors, demonstrating how closely human disease patterns were linked to patterns of travel and trade. The disease moved up the Rhone Valley from the Mediterranean coast into the heart of France, followed the Rhine Valley into Germany, and spread along the North Sea and Baltic coasts to reach Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. These geographic patterns would become important for understanding how future epidemics might spread, though such understanding was centuries in the future. The social and cultural diversity of medieval Europe meant that different regions responded to the plague in markedly different ways, creating a complex mosaic of survival strategies, religious interpretations, and social changes. Italian city-states, with their sophisticated commercial networks and relatively advanced medical knowledge, often implemented quarantine measures and public health policies that may have reduced mortality somewhat. Northern European societies, with their different religious traditions and social structures, tended to emphasize prayer, penance, and supernatural explanations for the epidemic. The linguistic barriers between different regions of Europe also complicated efforts to share information about the plague and coordinate responses to it. Accounts of successful treatments or preventive measures that worked in one area often failed to reach other regions in time to be useful, or were misunderstood when they were translated between languages. This communication problem meant that each community had to learn how to cope with plague largely on its own, often repeating mistakes that had already been made elsewhere. The symptoms of plague were not just medically devastating, but psychologically traumatic for those who witnessed them. The buboes were perhaps the most characteristic feature. These swollen lymph nodes would appear suddenly and grow rapidly, causing excruciating pain. Victims would often be unable to move the affected limb, and the sight of these grotesque swellings was deeply disturbing to family members and caregivers. The buboes would sometimes burst on their own, releasing foul-smelling pus and blood, which many interpreted as the body literally rotting while the person was still alive. The smell associated with plague victims was reportedly so distinctive and overwhelming that people could often detect the disease before any visible symptoms appeared. The fever associated with plague was intense and often accompanied by delirium and hallucinations. Victims would rave about seeing demons or angels, would speak to deceased relatives, or would become convinced that their family members were trying to poison them. This psychological component added another layer of terror for families watching their loved ones succumb to the disease. Children would no longer recognize their parents. Spouses would become suspicious and paranoid toward each other. And the normal bonds of affection and care that held families together would sometimes dissolve in the face of the disease's psychological effects. The speed with which the plague could progress from first symptoms to death was perhaps its most terrifying characteristic. While some victims lingered for weeks, others would seem healthy in the morning and be dead by evening. There are accounts of people collapsing in the street while going about their daily business, of merchants dying while conducting transactions, of priests collapsing while delivering sermons. This unpredictability meant that no one could feel safe, even for a moment. The phrase, "healthy at noon, dead at vespers," became a common way to describe the plague's lightning-fast progression. The medical community of the time was completely helpless in the face of the plague, which added to the general terror and despair. Physicians, who were already rare and expensive, began to flee affected areas or simply refused to treat plague patients. Those who remained often made the situation worse with treatments that seem barbaric to modern sensibilities, but were considered cutting-edge medicine at the time. Bloodletting, the practice of deliberately draining blood from patients, was thought to help balance the humors, but instead weakened already dying patients. Physicians would lance the buboes, causing additional pain and often introducing secondary infections. They prescribed various herbal remedies, many of which were completely ineffective, and some of which were actually toxic. One of the most tragic aspects of medieval plague treatment was the use of theriac, a supposed cure-all that contained dozens of ingredients, including viper's flesh, opium, and various exotic spices. Theriac was extremely expensive, meaning that only the wealthy could afford it, yet it was completely useless against the plague. This created a cruel irony where the rich could afford expensive but ineffective treatments, while the poor, who couldn't afford theriac, actually had better chances of survival simply because they weren't being subjected to harmful medical interventions. The failure of expensive medicine to save the wealthy challenged medieval assumptions about the relationship between wealth, virtue, and divine favor. The social disruption caused by the plague was as devastating as the disease itself. Entire families would be wiped out within days, leaving no one to care for livestock, tend crops, or maintain businesses. In rural areas, cattle would wander freely after their owners had died, and unharvested crops would rot in the fields. In cities, shops would remain shuttered for weeks, their proprietors either dead or fled. The normal rhythms of economic life ground to a halt as people became too afraid to venture out or conduct business with strangers who might carry the infection. The breakdown of social order during plague outbreaks was particularly evident in the disruption of funeral practices. In normal times, the dead would be washed and prepared by family members, laid out for viewing, and given elaborate funeral ceremonies before burial in consecrated ground. The plague made such practices impossible, partly because there were simply too many dead to handle individually, and partly because people were afraid that handling corpses would spread the infection. Bodies began to pile up in homes, in the streets, and in makeshift morgues. Cities hired special collectors to cart away the dead, often piling them into massive plague pits without individual graves or religious ceremonies. The complete breakdown of traditional funeral customs created a psychological trauma that extended far beyond the immediate grief of losing loved ones. Medieval society placed enormous importance on the proper treatment of the dead, believing that the soul's journey to the afterlife depended on receiving appropriate funeral rites. Families were expected to wash and anoint the body, to hold vigils where friends and neighbors could pay their respects, and to arrange for masses to be said for the deceased's soul. These customs provided structure and meaning during times of loss, helping survivors process their grief, while ensuring that the dead received the spiritual care necessary for their eternal welfare. The plague made all of these comforting rituals impossible. Bodies had to be disposed of quickly to prevent the spread of infection, often before family members had even been notified of the death. Professional body collectors, known as bikini in Italy, would make rounds through affected neighborhoods with carts, collecting corpses like garbage and hauling them to mass burial sites outside the city walls. These men were often criminals or desperate individuals who took the job because no one else would do it, and they were feared and shunned by the general population, who viewed them as harbingers of death. The mass burial sites themselves became sources of ongoing trauma for medieval communities. Enormous pits were dug outside city walls, sometimes large enough to hold hundreds or even thousands of bodies. The dead were thrown into these pits without shrouds, coffins, or individual graves, often layered like cordwood and covered with lime to speed decomposition. The sight and smell of these plague pits was overwhelming, and they remained visible reminders of the catastrophe for years after the epidemic had passed. The spiritual implications of improper burial were perhaps even more disturbing to medieval people than the physical horror of the mass graves. Christian theology taught that the body would be resurrected on Judgment Day, and many people worried that loved ones buried in anonymous mass graves would not be able to rise properly when Christ returned. There was also widespread belief that souls who had not received proper funeral rites would be unable to find peace in the afterlife and might return as ghosts or demons to haunt the living. The disruption of funeral customs also had important social and legal consequences. In normal times, funerals served important functions in confirming property inheritance, settling debts, and maintaining social relationships within the community. When these ceremonies became impossible, families often found themselves in legal disputes about inheritance rights, unsettled business obligations, and unclear social status. The absence of witnesses to confirm deaths meant that some people were able to falsely claim that relatives had died and attempt to inherit their property, while others found themselves unable to prove that family members were actually dead and therefore could not claim their rightful inheritance. The profession of undertaking, which had previously been carried out by family members with the assistance of clergy, began to professionalize during the plague years as specialized body collectors took over the handling of the dead. These men developed new techniques for rapid corpse disposal and mass burial that would influence funeral practices for centuries to come. While their work was essential for preventing the spread of disease, it also marked the beginning of a more impersonal and commercialized approach to death that gradually replaced the intimate family-centered rituals that had characterized medieval funeral customs. The psychological impact of witnessing these mass burials cannot be overstated. Medieval people placed enormous importance on proper funeral rites, believing that without them, the soul could not find peace in the afterlife. To see loved ones thrown into anonymous mass graves was spiritually as well as emotionally devastating. Survivors often lived with the guilt and horror of knowing their family members had been denied the dignity of a proper burial, and many believed this meant their souls would wander the earth as restless spirits. This fear of improper burial was so intense that some people would write detailed wills specifying how they wanted to be buried, even though they knew there was little chance their wishes would be honored during a plague outbreak. The plague also disrupted the normal functioning of religious institutions, which were supposed to provide comfort and guidance during times of crisis. Priests and monks died at rates even higher than the general population because they continued to minister to the sick and dying, exposing themselves repeatedly to infection. Entire monasteries were wiped out, sometimes with only 1 or 2 survivors left to tell the tale. Churches were forced to close when there were no clergy left to conduct services, and many people interpreted this as a sign that God had abandoned them entirely. The catastrophic loss of religious personnel created a crisis that went far beyond the immediate problem of conducting church services. Medieval monasteries and convents were not just religious institutions, but also centers of learning, medical care, and social services. Monks and nuns ran hospitals, schools, orphanages, and programs to feed the poor. They preserved and copied manuscripts, maintained libraries, and served as the intellectual backbone of medieval civilization. When plague swept through these religious communities, it destroyed not just individual lives, but entire institutions that had taken centuries to build. The loss of monastic communities was particularly devastating for medieval intellectual life. Many monasteries had accumulated libraries containing thousands of manuscripts, representing centuries of scholarly work, religious commentary, and classical texts that had been preserved from the ancient world. When plague killed the monks who maintained these libraries, many precious manuscripts were lost forever, either through neglect, fire, or simple decay. Some libraries were abandoned entirely, their books scattered to the winds or destroyed by vandals who saw no value in the scholarly works that had been so carefully preserved. The educational system of medieval Europe, which depended heavily on cathedral schools and monastic institutions, suffered severe disruption during the plague years. Young men who might have become the next generation of clergy and scholars died before completing their training, while experienced teachers and masters died before they could pass on their knowledge. Some educational institutions closed permanently, while others struggled for decades to rebuild their faculties and maintain their educational programs. The plague also created a crisis of religious authority that had profound implications for the future of Christianity in Europe. With so many priests dead or fled, ordinary people were forced to take on religious responsibilities that had previously been reserved for ordained clergy. Lay people began conducting funeral services, hearing confessions, and even attempting to perform other sacraments that were supposed to be administered only by priests. While this democratization of religious authority was born of necessity, it also challenged traditional assumptions about the special status of the clergy and the institutional authority of the church. The shortage of priests led to a dramatic decline in the quality of religious education and pastoral care in many areas. Bishops, desperate to fill empty parishes, often ordained men with minimal training or education, leading to a generation of clergy who were poorly prepared for their responsibilities. These hastily ordained priests often lacked the theological knowledge necessary to provide spiritual guidance during a time of unprecedented crisis, and their inadequate performance further undermined confidence in religious institutions. The economic foundations of religious institutions were also severely damaged by the plague. Monasteries and churches depended on donations from the faithful, rents from agricultural properties, and income from various religious services. With so much of the population dead or impoverished, these revenue sources dried up dramatically. Many religious institutions were forced to sell property, dismiss staff, or even close permanently because they could no longer afford to operate. The loss of these institutions meant that communities lost not just their spiritual centers, but also important providers of social services and economic activity. The plague years also saw the emergence of new forms of religious expression that reflected the changed spiritual needs of plague survivors. Mystical movements that emphasize direct personal experience of the divine became increasingly popular as people sought spiritual consolation that didn't depend on institutional religious structures. Lay religious societies proliferated, allowing ordinary people to pursue religious devotion without relying on formal clerical authority. These new forms of spirituality would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation and other major religious changes that transformed European Christianity in subsequent centuries. The shortage of clergy created a crisis of spiritual authority that had profound implications for medieval society. In normal times, people relied on priests to interpret God's will, to provide absolution for sins, and to perform the sacraments necessary for salvation. With so many clergy dead or fled, ordinary people were left to grapple with theological questions on their own. Some concluded that the plague was divine punishment for the sins of humanity, and that the only response was increased prayer and penance. Others began to question whether the Church had been teaching the truth about God's nature, and whether traditional religious practices had any real power to protect believers. This religious crisis manifested in several disturbing ways. Some people became convinced that the end times were at hand and that the plague was one of the apocalyptic signs described in the book of Revelation. They would abandon their worldly possessions, gather in groups to pray continuously, and wait for the second coming of Christ. Others turned to more extreme forms of religious expression, such as the flagellant movement, where groups of people would travel from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance, hoping to convince God to end the plague. The flagellants were particularly disturbing to witness, as they believed that by inflicting pain on themselves, they could take on the suffering that God had intended for the whole community. They would march through towns in procession, stripping to the waist and beating themselves with leather whips studded with metal spikes until their backs were raw and bleeding. They would sing hymns and cry out for God's mercy while spectators watched in fascination and horror. While some people viewed the flagellants as holy martyrs, Others saw them as dangerous fanatics whose extreme behavior was making the crisis worse. The plague also gave rise to widespread scapegoating as people desperately sought someone to blame for their suffering. In many parts of Europe, Jewish communities became the primary target of this misdirected anger. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories claimed that Jews had poisoned wells or were somehow responsible for spreading the disease as part of a plot against Christian society. These accusations were completely baseless and flew in the face of the obvious fact that Jews were dying from plague at the same rates as everyone else. But logic had little power against fear and prejudice. The persecution of Jewish communities during the plague years was systematic and brutal. Entire Jewish quarters were surrounded by angry mobs who would force the inhabitants into synagogues or other buildings and then set them on fire. In some cities, Jews were given the choice between conversion to Christianity or execution, though even conversion didn't always guarantee safety. The Jewish community in Strasbourg was burned alive on a specially constructed platform in the town cemetery, while in Mainz, the entire Jewish population took refuge in the synagogue and set it on fire themselves rather than face the mob outside. The anti-Jewish violence during the plague years was characterized by both spontaneous mob action and carefully orchestrated campaigns of persecution that reveal the deep-seated prejudices and social tensions that had been building in medieval European society long before the plague arrived. In many cases, the accusations against Jewish communities were clearly pretexts for settling economic grievances, seizing property, or eliminating competition from Jewish merchants and moneylenders. Christian debtors saw an opportunity to cancel their obligations by eliminating their Jewish creditors, while Christian merchants viewed the persecution as a chance to remove Jewish competitors from profitable trades. The scale and coordination of anti-Jewish violence in some regions suggests that it was not simply a spontaneous response to plague fears, but rather a deliberate campaign that used the epidemic as an excuse for achieving long-planned objectives. In the Rhineland, attacks on Jewish communities followed similar patterns across multiple cities, with mobs using similar accusations and methods. Local authorities sometimes participated directly in the violence, while in other cases they stood aside and allowed it to proceed, claiming they were powerless to prevent it. The economic motivations behind anti-Jewish persecution were often barely concealed beneath the veneer of religious and medical accusations. Jewish communities had often prospered in medieval Europe precisely because they were excluded from many traditional occupations and forced to specialize in trades like money lending, long-distance commerce, and skilled crafts that Christian guilds restricted. This economic success, achieved despite severe legal and social disadvantages, created resentment among Christian competitors who saw Jewish prosperity as evidence of unfair advantages or supernatural assistance. The legal vulnerability of Jewish communities made them particularly attractive targets during times of social crisis. In most parts of medieval Europe, Jews lived under special legal arrangements that provided them with some protection from arbitrary violence, but also marked them as outsiders who existed at the sufferance of Christian rulers. When social order broke down during plague outbreaks, these legal protections often proved worthless, and Jewish communities found themselves completely defenseless against mob violence. The religious dimensions of anti-Jewish persecution during the plague were complex and often contradictory. While some Christians attacked Jewish communities based on theological hostility and conspiracy theories about Jewish responsibility for the epidemic, others recognized the obvious fact that Jews were dying from plague at the same rates as Christians and concluded that they could not be responsible for spreading the disease. Some Christian clergy attempted to protect Jewish communities and argued that persecution was contrary to Christian principles, but their voices were often drowned out by more militant anti-Jewish rhetoric. The psychological mechanisms behind anti-Jewish scapegoating reveal important aspects of how medieval people processed the trauma and uncertainty of plague epidemic. Faced with a catastrophe that seemed random and inexplicable, many people found it psychologically necessary to identify human agents who could be blamed and punished. Jewish communities provided convenient targets because they were already marginalized, because existing prejudices made accusations against them seem plausible to many Christians, and because attacking them provided an outlet for the rage and frustration that people felt about their helplessness in the face of the epidemic. The long-term consequences of anti-Jewish violence during the plague years extended far beyond the immediate loss of life and property. Many of the most vibrant and intellectually sophisticated Jewish communities in Western Europe were permanently destroyed, representing a tremendous loss of cultural and intellectual resources that would have benefited European civilization as a whole. The survivors who fled to Eastern Europe took with them not only their religious traditions, but also their commercial skills, scientific knowledge, and cultural achievements, enriching their new homes while impoverishing the regions they had been forced to leave. The precedent of systematic persecution during the plague years established patterns of anti-Jewish violence that would recur throughout European history. The techniques of mob organization, the rhetorical justifications for persecution, and the legal mechanisms for stripping Jewish communities of their property and rights were all refined during the plague years and would be used again in later centuries. The plague persecutions thus represent not just a tragic episode in medieval history, but also an important step in the development of the systematic anti-Semitism that would plague Europe for centuries to come. These atrocities against Jewish communities had long-lasting consequences that extended far beyond the plague years. Many of the most prosperous and culturally sophisticated Jewish communities in Europe were completely destroyed, representing a tremendous loss of human knowledge, culture, and economic expertise. The survivors who managed to flee often settled in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland and Lithuania, where rulers offered them protection in exchange for their commercial and financial skills. This migration helped establish the great centers of Jewish learning in Eastern Europe that would flourish for centuries. But it also left Western Europe culturally and economically impoverished by the loss of its Jewish populations. The economic disruption caused by the plague was both immediate and long-lasting, fundamentally altering the structure of European society. With somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population dead, there was suddenly a severe shortage of workers in every field. Crops rotted in the fields because there weren't enough peasants to harvest them. Livestock died because there was no one to tend them. Workshops closed because master craftsmen had died, and there were no apprentices to carry on their trades. Ships sat idle in harbors because there weren't enough sailors to crew them. The immediate economic consequences of such massive population loss were staggering in their scope and complexity. Agricultural production, which formed the backbone of medieval economy, collapsed in many regions as entire farming communities were wiped out. Fields that had been cultivated for centuries were abandoned and quickly reverted to wilderness. Sophisticated agricultural techniques that had taken generations to develop were lost when the farmers who practiced them died without passing on their knowledge. Irrigation systems fell into disrepair. Mills stopped functioning, and livestock breeding programs that had produced improved strains of cattle, sheep, and horses were interrupted or abandoned entirely. The craft industries that had flourished in medieval towns and cities faced equally severe disruption. Guild systems that had carefully regulated the training of apprentices and the quality of manufactured goods broke down when master craftsmen died before they could train successors. Specialized skills in metalworking, textile production, leather crafting, and dozens of other trades were lost or severely degraded. Some crafts disappeared entirely from certain regions, forcing communities to import goods they had previously produced locally or to do without them altogether. The financial systems that had enabled medieval commerce to flourish across long distances also faced severe strain. Banking houses that had built their wealth on carefully calculated lending and investment strategies found themselves facing massive defaults as borrowers died or fled. International trade networks that depended on personal relationships and trust between merchants were disrupted when key participants died. Letters of credit became worthless when the institutions that had issued them no longer existed. Insurance contracts, which were just beginning to develop in some parts of Europe, proved inadequate to cover the unprecedented scale of losses caused by the plague. The monetary system itself faced severe challenges as the normal flow of coins and precious metals was disrupted. Mints closed when their operators died, creating shortages of new coinage precisely when economic disruption made reliable currency most necessary. Hoarding became common as people lost confidence in normal economic institutions, further reducing the supply of money in circulation. Some regions experienced severe inflation as the reduced population competed for a diminished supply of goods, while others saw deflation as demand collapsed along with the population. Urban centers, which had been the engines of economic growth and innovation in medieval Europe, faced particular challenges. Cities had grown large precisely because they offered economic opportunities that couldn't be found in rural areas. But these same concentrations of population made them especially vulnerable to plague. When urban populations collapsed, the specialized economic functions that cities had performed became difficult or impossible to maintain. Some cities never recovered their pre-plague population levels, while others underwent fundamental changes in their economic character. The disruption of trade routes had consequences that extended far beyond Europe itself. The plague interrupted the flow of luxury goods from Asia, including spices, silks, and precious stones that had been central to European commerce for centuries. This disruption encouraged European merchants to seek new trade routes and partners, contributing to the eventual European exploration of Africa and the Americas. The search for alternative sources of Asian goods would become one of the driving forces behind the age of exploration that began in the 15th century.
Rural economic systems faced their own unique challenges as the traditional relationships between lords and peasants broke down.
Manor houses that had served as centers of agricultural administration and economic coordination were often abandoned when their lord and his administrative staff died. Without this coordination, complex agricultural systems that depended on cooperation between multiple villages or the sharing of resources like mills and livestock became difficult to maintain. Some regions experienced a reversion to much simpler, more subsistence-oriented agriculture that could be managed by individual families without the need for complex social coordination.
This labor shortage had profound implications for the feudal system that had dominated European society for centuries.
Before the plague, peasants were tied to the land and had little bargaining power with their lords. There were always more peasants than available land, so lords could demand high rents and extensive labor service while paying very low wages. After the plague, the situation was completely reversed. Suddenly, peasants were in high demand, and they began to realize they could demand better conditions, higher wages, and more freedom. The transformation of labor relations represented one of the most significant social changes in European history. Peasants who had previously been bound to their lords' estates by legal, economic, and social ties suddenly found themselves in a position to negotiate. Lords who had once commanded absolute obedience from their peasants now had to compete for workers by offering better terms, higher wages, and greater personal freedom. This shift in bargaining power fundamentally altered the social contract that had governed rural life for centuries. The process by which peasants gained greater bargaining power varied significantly from region to region, but the general pattern was remarkably consistent across Europe. In areas where population loss had been severe, surviving peasants often found themselves managing much larger holdings than they had previously worked, simply because there was no one else available to tend abandoned lands. These peasants quickly realized that they could demand payment for their extra work or threaten to abandon the additional holdings if lords refused to meet their terms. The mobility of labor, which had been strictly controlled under the feudal system, became a reality for many peasants during the post-plague period. Peasants who had been legally bound to specific estates discovered that lords in neighboring areas were willing to overlook traditional legal restrictions if it meant securing desperately needed workers. Some peasants used this mobility to play different lords against each other, moving from estate to estate in search of the best terms. Others used the threat of mobility to extract concessions from their traditional lords. The social implications of these economic changes extended far beyond simple wage negotiations. Peasants who had grown accustomed to greater economic independence began to demand political and social recognition as well. They wanted representation in local government, the right to participate in legal proceedings as equals rather than as subordinates, and recognition of their essential role in society. These demands challenged the fundamental assumptions of feudal hierarchy and contributed to a broader questioning of traditional authority structures. The response of the nobility to these challenges was often harsh and sometimes violent. Many lords attempted to maintain their traditional privileges through legal coercion, physical intimidation, and appeals to religious authority. They argued that the social hierarchy was divinely ordained and that peasant demands for equality were tantamount to rebellion against God himself. Some lords organized militias to force peasants back to their traditional holdings and to prevent them from seeking better terms elsewhere. However, the economic reality of labor shortages made it impossible for lords to maintain the old system through force alone. Lords who tried to rely entirely on coercion often found their estates falling into ruin as peasants fled to areas where they could get better treatment. The most successful lords were those who adapted to the new reality by offering competitive wages, reducing labor obligations, and providing better living conditions for their workers. This pragmatic approach helped maintain agricultural production, but also accelerated the breakdown of traditional feudal relationships. The transformation of rural labor relations also had important implications for the development of capitalism and market-oriented agriculture. As peasants gained greater control over their own labor and began to receive wages for their work, they also gained experience in market transactions and developed a better understanding of their economic value. Some enterprising peasants began to accumulate capital and invest in improved tools, better livestock, or additional land holdings, laying the groundwork for the emergence of a rural middle class that would play an important role in later economic development. Many peasants simply abandoned their traditional holdings and moved to areas where lords were offering better terms. Others demanded to be paid in cash rather than working for room and board. Some even had the audacity to negotiate with their lords, threatening to leave unless their conditions were improved. This represented a fundamental shift in the power relationship between lords and peasants, one that would eventually contribute to the breakdown of feudalism and the rise of a more mobile, wage-based labor system. The response of the ruling class to these economic changes was swift and often harsh.
In England, the government passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351, which attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from moving freely in search of better conditions.
Similar laws were passed throughout Europe, all attempting to maintain the old social order through legal coercion. However, these laws were extremely difficult to enforce when there was such high demand for labor, and many employers were willing to ignore the law and pay higher wages to attract workers. The failure of these wage control laws led to increased social tension and eventually to outright rebellion. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was directly connected to the social and economic changes brought about by the plague. Peasants, who had grown accustomed to higher wages and greater freedom, were no longer willing to accept the old feudal relationships. They demanded the abolition of serfdom, the right to rent land at reasonable rates, and the freedom to sell their labor to the highest bidder. Though the revolt was eventually suppressed, it marked a turning point in European social history and demonstrated that the old order could no longer be maintained through force alone. The psychological trauma of living through the plague years had effects that lasted for generations. People who survived the Black Death lived with the constant fear that the plague might return at any time. And indeed, smaller outbreaks continued to occur throughout the late medieval period. This created a culture of anxiety and uncertainty that influenced art, literature, philosophy, and religion for centuries to come. The memento mori tradition in art, which reminded viewers of the inevitability of death, became much more prominent after the plague.
Dance of death imagery, showing skeletons leading people from all walks of life to their graves, became a common theme in church decorations and manuscript illustrations. The development of memento mori art and death imagery during and after the plague years reveals the profound psychological impact that the epidemic had on European consciousness. Before the plague, medieval art had certainly acknowledged the reality of death, but it was typically portrayed in the context of salvation, resurrection, and eternal life. The post-plague period saw the emergence of a much more visceral and immediate confrontation with mortality, expressed through artistic works that forced viewers to contemplate their own inevitable demise in graphic and often disturbing ways. The Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre, became one of the most powerful and enduring artistic responses to the plague experience. These elaborate artistic cycles typically showed death, portrayed as a skeleton or decomposing corpse, leading representatives of every social class and profession to their graves.
Kings and peasants, bishops and merchants, young and old, all were shown as equally powerless in the face of death's summons.
The democratic message of these works reflected the plague's indiscriminate nature and challenged traditional assumptions about social hierarchy and divine favor. The psychological function of Dance of Death imagery was complex and multifaceted.
On one level, these works served as moral instruction, reminding viewers that earthly distinctions of wealth and status were meaningless in the face of mortality, and encouraging them to focus on spiritual preparation for death.
On another level, they provided a way for plague survivors to process their trauma by giving artistic form to the random, arbitrary nature of plague mortality that they had witnessed firsthand. The images helped normalize the abnormal experience of mass death by placing it within a familiar artistic and religious framework. The popularity of memento mori themes in post-plague art also reflected a broader shift in medieval spirituality toward more personal and emotional forms of religious expression. The traditional medieval emphasis on communal worship and institutional religious authority gave way to a more individualistic spirituality that emphasized personal preparation for death and direct relationship with the divine. This shift was reflected not only in artistic themes, but also in the development of new forms of private devotion, personal prayer books, and mystical religious practices. The literary response to the plague was equally profound and lasting. Writers who lived through the epidemic or grew up in its aftermath produced works that reflected a fundamentally altered understanding of human existence and divine justice. The random, seemingly meaningless nature of plague death challenged traditional theological explanations of suffering as divine punishment for sin. If good Christians died alongside sinners, if innocent children perished while criminals survived, what did this say about God's justice and the moral order of the universe? The philosophical implications of the plague experience influenced the development of nominalism and other intellectual movements that questioned traditional authorities and emphasized individual experience over received wisdom. Scholars who had witnessed the complete failure of traditional medicine and theology to explain or prevent the plague became more skeptical of claims to universal knowledge and more interested in empirical observation and practical experience. This intellectual shift would eventually contribute to the scientific revolution and the development of modern experimental methodology. The plague also influenced the development of new forms of historical consciousness and record-keeping. Chronicles and histories written during and after the plague years show a new attention to demographic data, mortality statistics, and the social consequences of epidemic disease.
Writers began to think more systematically about cause and effect in human history, and to document the experiences of ordinary people, rather than focusing exclusively on the deeds of kings and nobles.
This broader historical perspective would influence the development of modern historiography and social science. The religious art of the post-plague period shows clear evidence of the trauma and spiritual questioning that followed the epidemic. Traditional religious themes like the crucifixion and the Last Judgment were reinterpreted to emphasize suffering, abandonment, and divine wrath rather than salvation and redemption. Christ was increasingly portrayed as a figure of suffering who shared humanity's experience of pain and death, rather than as a triumphant king ruling from heaven. The Virgin Mary was often shown as a mother grieving for her dead son, providing a model for the countless parents who had lost children to plague. The development of new religious movements and spiritual practices during the post-plague period reflects the widespread crisis of faith that followed the epidemic. Many people found traditional religious institutions and practices inadequate for addressing their spiritual needs in the wake of such massive suffering and loss. Mystical movements that promised direct personal experience of the divine became increasingly popular, as did lay religious societies that allowed ordinary people to pursue spiritual goals without relying on formal clerical authority. These new forms of spirituality would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation and other major religious changes that transformed European Christianity. Literature from the post-plague period reflects this preoccupation with mortality and the fragility of human existence. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, includes numerous references to the plague and its effects on society. The characters in the tales represent a cross-section of English society, but they are all traveling on pilgrimage, which itself reflects the increased religiosity and concern with salvation that followed the plague years. Chaucer's realistic portrayal of human nature, with all its flaws and contradictions, also reflects a more cynical worldview that developed after people had witnessed the breakdown of social order and moral authority during the plague. The plague also had profound effects on the development of medicine and public health practices, though these changes took place over several centuries rather than immediately. The complete failure of traditional medical theory and practice during the plague years led some physicians to begin questioning the ancient authorities they had always relied upon. While the scientific method was still centuries away, some medical practitioners began to place greater emphasis on direct observation and empirical evidence, rather than simply accepting what they had read in old texts. Cities that survived major plague outbreaks began to develop some of the first systematic public health measures in European history. Venice established the first quarantine system, requiring ships arriving from infected areas to wait 40 days before being allowed to dock. Milan developed some of the first systematic methods for isolating infected individuals and cleaning contaminated areas. These measures were often based on incorrect theories about how the plague spread, but they represented important steps toward the development of modern public health practices. The plague also contributed to changes in urban planning and architecture that would have long-lasting effects on European cities. People began to associate crowded, dirty conditions with disease, leading to efforts to widen streets, improve drainage, and reduce population density in the most crowded areas. Wealthy families began to build houses with better ventilation and sanitation, and some cities established regulations governing the disposal of waste and the maintenance of clean water supplies. The religious and philosophical implications of the plague continued to reverberate for centuries after the initial outbreak. The fact that prayer, penance, and religious devotion had proven powerless to stop the plague led many people to question traditional teachings about God's relationship with humanity. If God was all-powerful and benevolent, why had he allowed such terrible suffering? If the Church was truly God's representative on earth, why had its priests and bishops been unable to stop the plague or even protect themselves from it? These questions contributed to the development of new religious movements that emphasized personal spirituality over institutional authority. Mysticism became increasingly popular as people sought direct personal relationships with God rather than relying on the mediation of clergy. Groups like the Brethren of the Common Life emphasized practical spirituality and good works rather than elaborate theological systems. These movements would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, as people became increasingly willing to challenge the authority of the Catholic Church. The plague also influenced the development of Renaissance humanism, though this connection is complex and often overlooked. The massive loss of human life during the plague years led survivors to place greater value on individual human existence and achievement. The medieval emphasis on the afterlife and the worthlessness of earthly existence began to give way to a more positive view of human potential and earthly accomplishment. This shift in values would eventually contribute to the artistic and intellectual flowering of the Renaissance. The demographic effects of the plague were felt for generations after the initial outbreak. In some regions, population levels didn't recover to pre-plague numbers for 200 years or more. This long-term population decline had complex effects on economic development, social structure, and cultural evolution. With fewer people competing for resources, those who survived often enjoyed higher standards of living than their ancestors had known. Per capita wealth increased significantly in many areas, contributing to the economic growth that would eventually fund Renaissance art and architecture. The plague also contributed to important changes in family structure and gender roles. With so many people dead, traditional family arrangements were often impossible to maintain. Women who would normally have lived under the protection and authority of fathers, husbands, or brothers found themselves suddenly independent and responsible for managing property and businesses. While this independence was often temporary, as social pressure encouraged women to remarry or place themselves under male guardianship as quickly as possible, it did provide some women with opportunities that would have been unthinkable before the plague. The demographic catastrophe of the plague created unprecedented opportunities for women to assume roles and responsibilities that had previously been restricted to men. Widows who inherited their husbands' businesses often found themselves operating as independent merchants, craftswomen, or property managers. Some women discovered they had considerable aptitude for these roles and resisted pressure to remarry, preferring to maintain their independence. Others used their business experience to negotiate better terms in subsequent marriages, demanding greater say in household management and property decisions. The shortage of male workers in many trades created opportunities for women to enter occupations that had previously been closed to them. Women began working as blacksmiths, carpenters, brewers, and in other skilled trades that had traditionally been male preserves. While guild regulations and social custom often prevented women from achieving full recognition as master craftswomen, their practical contributions to economic recovery were essential and widely acknowledged. Some women were able to establish successful businesses that they passed on to their daughters, creating multi-generational female entrepreneurship that would have been impossible before the plague. The disruption of traditional marriage patterns during the plague years also created new possibilities for women's autonomy and social mobility. With so many potential partners dead, women had greater choice in selecting husbands and could often negotiate better terms for marriage contracts. Some women chose to delay marriage or remain single, using their economic independence to pursue religious vocations, artistic endeavors, or other forms of self-expression. The economic value of women's labor meant that families were often willing to invest in educating daughters who might need to support themselves independently. The crisis in religious institutions created particular opportunities for women to assume leadership roles in spiritual communities. With so many male clergy dead or fled, women often took on responsibilities for maintaining religious observances, caring for the sick, and providing spiritual guidance to their communities. Some women founded new religious communities or reformed existing ones, often emphasizing practical service to the poor and sick rather than contemplative withdrawal from the world. These women religious leaders gained considerable influence and respect, though they remained excluded from formal priestly roles. The legal status of women also began to change in response to the practical necessities created by the plague. Courts were forced to recognize women's capacity to manage property, enter into contracts, and represent themselves in legal proceedings when there were no male relatives available to act on their behalf. While these changes were initially justified as temporary expedients, they established precedents that would gradually expand women's legal rights in subsequent centuries. Women who had successfully managed complex business or property arrangements during the crisis were difficult to exclude from similar roles once social conditions stabilized. The educational opportunities available to women also expanded during the post-plague period, partly because the shortage of educated men created demand for literate and numerate workers regardless of gender. Some schools and universities began accepting female students, though usually in small numbers and often with restrictions on their participation. More commonly, women received practical education through apprenticeships in family businesses or through informal networks of female entrepreneurs who shared knowledge and expertise. This expansion of women's education contributed to the gradual development of a more literate and economically sophisticated female population. The cultural impact of women's expanded roles during the plague years can be seen in literature,
art, and religious writing that began to portray women as more complex and capable figures. Female characters in post-plague literature are often shown as resourceful managers, successful entrepreneurs, or wise counselors, rather than simply as idealized symbols of virtue or dangerous temptresses. Religious art began to emphasize the Virgin Mary's role as an intercessor and protector, reflecting the increased importance of women's practical and spiritual leadership in plague-devastated communities. However, the expansion of women's opportunities during the plague years also generated significant resistance from men who viewed female independence as a threat to traditional social order. As demographic conditions stabilized and economic recovery began, there were often systematic efforts to restore traditional gender roles and limit women's participation in public life. Legal restrictions were reimposed, guild regulations were enforced more strictly, and social pressure was applied to encourage women to return to traditional domestic roles. The struggle between expanded opportunities and traditional constraints would become a recurring theme in European women's history for centuries to come. The shortage of clergy created opportunities for women to take on religious roles that had previously been restricted to men. While women could never be ordained as priests, they could become influential religious teachers, mystics, and leaders of lay religious movements. Some women who survived the plague years founded new religious communities or reformed existing ones, leaving lasting marks on the development of European Christianity. The trauma of the plague years also influenced European attitudes toward outsiders and foreign lands for centuries to come. Since the plague was correctly understood to have originated in Asia and spread along trade routes, many Europeans developed a deep suspicion of foreign merchants, exotic goods, and contact with distant lands. This xenophobia would have complex effects on European expansion and colonization in later centuries, as Europeans simultaneously sought to exploit foreign lands while fearing contamination from foreign diseases and influences. The memory of the plague became embedded in European folklore and popular culture in ways that shaped attitudes toward disease, death, and social order for generations. Folk tales warned of the dangers of challenging God's will or abandoning traditional moral values, often featuring characters who were punished with plague-like diseases for their transgressions. These stories served as cautionary tales that reinforced social conformity and religious orthodoxy, even as the specific memory of the Black Death faded into the distant past. The plague also influenced the development of insurance and other financial instruments designed to manage risk and uncertainty. Merchants who had seen their colleagues die suddenly and their carefully planned trading ventures collapse overnight began to develop more sophisticated methods for spreading risk and protecting their investments. Italian banking houses pioneered many of the techniques that would eventually become standard business practices throughout Europe, including complex partnership agreements, insurance contracts, and letters of credit that could survive the death of individual partners. The artistic and literary legacy of the plague years continued to influence European culture for centuries after the initial outbreak. The tradition of depicting death as a universal leveler that claimed rich and poor, young and old, noble and commoner alike became a staple of European art. These images served both as reminders of human mortality and as subtle critiques of social inequality, suggesting that earthly distinctions of rank and wealth were ultimately meaningless in the face of death.
The plague also contributed to the development of more realistic and psychologically complex approaches to art and literature. Artists who had witnessed the breakdown of social order and the extremes of human behavior during plague outbreaks brought a new understanding of human nature to their work. This psychological realism would become one of the defining characteristics of Renaissance art, and would eventually influence the development of modern literature and drama. The medical legacy of the plague was equally complex and long-lasting. While the immediate response to the plague was often counterproductive, the long-term effects included important advances in medical education, public health policy, and scientific methodology. Universities began to place greater emphasis on practical medical training rather than purely theoretical study. Medical schools started requiring students to observe actual patients rather than simply reading ancient texts. These changes were slow and often resisted by traditional authorities, but they represented important steps toward the development of modern scientific medicine. The plague also contributed to the development of more systematic approaches to record-keeping and data analysis. Cities that survived major outbreaks began to maintain detailed records of births, deaths, and disease outbreaks, partly to help predict and prepare for future epidemics. These records became some of the earliest systematic demographic data in European history, and provided valuable information for understanding population trends, economic cycles, and social change. The development of systematic record-keeping during the plague years represented a fundamental shift in how medieval authorities approached the management of urban populations and public health. Before the plague, most cities maintained only rudimentary records of vital statistics, usually limited to baptismal records kept by individual parishes and occasional tax records compiled for specific purposes. The scale of mortality during plague outbreaks made it clear that more comprehensive and systematic documentation was necessary for effective governance and planning. Italian city-states led the way in developing sophisticated systems for tracking demographic changes and health threats. Venice established one of the first comprehensive systems for recording deaths, with detailed information about the deceased person's age, occupation, cause of death, and location within the city. This information was compiled weekly and analyzed by city officials who used it to identify patterns in disease transmission and to allocate resources for public health measures. The Venetian system became a model for other cities throughout Europe and established principles of demographic analysis that would influence statistical science for centuries to come. The process of collecting and analyzing demographic data during plague outbreaks also led to important innovations in mathematical and statistical methods. Officials responsible for tracking mortality rates had to develop new techniques for calculating death rates, projecting population changes, and comparing mortality patterns across different neighborhoods or time periods. These practical problems encouraged the development of more sophisticated mathematical tools and laid important groundwork for the eventual emergence of actuarial science and epidemiological analysis. The improved record-keeping systems that emerged during the plague years also had important implications for legal and property rights.
With so many people dying suddenly, and often without proper wills or clear inheritance arrangements, courts needed better documentation of family relationships, property ownership, and business partnerships. Cities began maintaining more detailed records of property transfers, marriage contracts, and commercial agreements, creating archives that would prove invaluable for legal proceedings and historical research in subsequent centuries. The administrative systems developed for managing plague outbreaks also contributed to the growth of governmental bureaucracy and professional civil service. Cities that successfully managed plague crises often did so by creating specialized administrative positions responsible for public health, emergency planning, and social services. These new administrative roles required educated personnel who could read, write, maintain records, and coordinate complex logistical operations. The development of professional urban administration during the plague years contributed to the eventual emergence of modern governmental systems based on trained bureaucrats rather than traditional hereditary authorities. The economic implications of improved record-keeping were equally significant. Merchants and bankers who survived the plague years recognized the importance of maintaining detailed records of transactions, partnerships, and market conditions. The Italian banking houses that dominated European finance during the late medieval period developed sophisticated accounting systems that allowed them to track complex international transactions and assess risks more accurately. These innovations in financial record-keeping contributed to the development of modern accounting practices and commercial law. The medical implications of systematic data collection during plague outbreaks were perhaps the most directly relevant for public health. Physicians and city officials who maintained detailed records of plague cases began to notice patterns in disease transmission that weren't apparent from casual observation. They observed that plague seemed to spread along specific routes through cities, that certain neighborhoods were more vulnerable than others, and that environmental factors like sanitation and population density influenced disease transmission. While they didn't understand the bacterial nature of plague or the role of fleas and rats, their empirical observations laid important groundwork for the eventual development of epidemiological science. The cultural impact of improved record-keeping extended beyond practical administrative concerns to influence how people thought about history, memory, and social change. The detailed chronicles and statistical records maintained during plague years provided unprecedented documentation of a major historical catastrophe, allowing future generations to understand the scope and impact of the epidemic in ways that wouldn't have been possible with traditional historical sources. This more systematic approach to historical documentation influenced the development of modern historiography and contributed to a more empirical and analytical approach to understanding social change. The international implications of improved demographic record-keeping were also significant. Cities and regions that maintained good records during plague outbreaks were better able to communicate with each other about disease patterns, effective treatments, and successful public health measures. This information sharing contributed to the development of informal networks of medical and administrative knowledge that crossed political boundaries and helped spread innovations in plague management throughout Europe.
The precedent of international cooperation in public health established during the plague years would eventually contribute to the development of modern international health organizations and disease surveillance systems.
The political effects of the plague were equally far-reaching and complex.
Kingdoms and empires that had seemed stable and powerful before the plague found themselves struggling to maintain order as their populations declined and their economic foundations crumbled. Some political entities, particularly smaller city-states and principalities, simply ceased to exist as their ruling families died out and there were no clear successors. Others underwent fundamental transformations as new groups seized power in the chaos following major outbreaks. The plague contributed to the decline of some traditional forms of political authority while strengthening others. The feudal system, which depended on a stable hierarchy of personal relationships between lords and vassals, was severely disrupted when so many of these relationships were broken by death. At the same time, centralized monarchies that could adapt quickly to changing circumstances often emerged stronger from the crisis, as they were better able to maintain order and coordinate responses to the emergency. The international effects of the plague were equally significant, as the disease disrupted trade networks, diplomatic relationships, and military campaigns throughout the known world. The Mongol Empire, which had facilitated the plague's spread along the Silk Road, was severely weakened by the demographic catastrophe and never fully recovered its former power and cohesion. The Byzantine Empire, already in decline before the plague, was further weakened and became increasingly vulnerable to Ottoman expansion. The Islamic world was similarly affected, with major centers of learning and culture suffering devastating population losses that took centuries to overcome. The plague also had important effects on technological and scientific development, though these were often indirect and took place over long periods. The severe labor shortages that followed major outbreaks created incentives for developing labor-saving technologies and more efficient production methods. Water mills and windmills became more common as communities sought to replace human labor with mechanical power. Agricultural techniques were refined to allow smaller populations to feed themselves adequately. These technological advances would eventually contribute to the economic growth and population recovery of the late medieval and early modern periods. The educational and intellectual legacy of the plague was equally complex and long-lasting. Many centers of learning were severely disrupted by the loss of teachers, students, and financial support. Some universities closed permanently, while others struggled for decades to rebuild their faculties and student bodies. At the same time, the intellectual challenges posed by the plague stimulated new forms of inquiry and scholarship. Philosophers and theologians grappled with questions about divine justice, human suffering, and the nature of causation that would influence European thought for centuries to come. The plague also contributed to important changes in legal and governmental institutions. Traditional legal systems, which often depended on personal relationships, oral traditions, and customary practices, proved inadequate for dealing with the complex problems created by massive population loss. New forms of written law, bureaucratic administration, and institutional continuity were developed to ensure that essential functions could continue even when key individuals died or fled. These innovations would become important foundations for the development of modern governmental systems. As we reach the end of our long journey through the plague years, it becomes clear that the fear people felt toward this disease was entirely justified by its devastating effects on every aspect of human existence. The plague was not just a medical crisis, but a complete social, economic, religious, and cultural catastrophe that reshaped European civilization in ways that are still visible today. The people who lived through these terrible years witnessed the collapse of everything they had believed was stable and permanent, from the social hierarchy that governed their daily lives to the religious institutions that promised them salvation. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story is not the destruction the plague caused, but the resilience and adaptability that humans demonstrated in response to it. Communities found new ways to care for their sick, bury their dead, and maintain essential services even under the most desperate circumstances. Artists and writers created works of lasting beauty and meaning while surrounded by death and despair. Scholars and physicians began the long process of developing better understanding of disease and healing, even though they lacked the scientific knowledge we take for granted today. The plague years also revealed both the worst and the best of human nature. The scapegoating of minority communities and the breakdown of social solidarity showed how quickly fear could transform ordinary people into perpetrators of terrible cruelties. At the same time, countless individuals showed extraordinary courage and compassion, caring for the sick at the risk of their own lives, sharing their meager resources with those in need, and working to maintain some semblance of civilization in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. The individual stories of heroism and sacrifice during the plague years, though often unrecorded in formal histories, represent some of the most inspiring examples of human courage in the face of mortal danger. Physicians who continued to treat patients despite knowing that close contact with plague victims was essentially a death sentence demonstrated a commitment to their professional obligations that transcended personal safety. Parents who nursed their children through fatal illnesses, knowing they were likely contracting the disease themselves, showed the depth of familial love and duty that could overcome even the most powerful survival instincts. Religious figures who continued to administer last rites, conduct funeral services, and provide spiritual comfort to the dying, despite seeing their colleagues fall victim to the plague, demonstrated a faith and dedication that inspired their communities, even as it often cost them their lives. Many of these clergy members could have fled to safer areas or abandoned their posts, as some did, but chose instead to remain with their flocks during their greatest time of need. Their sacrifice helped maintain some continuity of spiritual and social leadership even as traditional institutions crumbled around them. Ordinary citizens who volunteered to serve as body collectors, grave diggers, and caregivers for plague victims often did so at great personal risk and with little compensation, beyond the knowledge that their community desperately needed their services. These individuals, often drawn from the poorest segments of society who had few other options, performed essential functions that helped prevent the complete breakdown of urban sanitation and social order. Their willingness to undertake these dangerous tasks, despite the social stigma and physical risks involved, represented a form of civic duty that helped hold communities together during their darkest hours.
The merchants and craftspeople who continued to operate essential services during plague outbreaks, maintaining food supplies, medical equipment, and other necessities despite severe disruptions to normal commercial networks, demonstrated the importance of economic resilience in maintaining social stability.
These individuals often had to overcome significant logistical challenges, including disrupted supply chains, reduced workforces, and dangerous working conditions. Yet their persistence helped ensure that basic needs could be met even during the worst phases of epidemic outbreaks. The scholars and chroniclers who documented the plague experience, often while living through it themselves, performed an invaluable service for future generations by preserving detailed accounts of how communities responded to unprecedented challenges. These written records provide not only historical documentation, but also practical guidance for understanding how societies can adapt to catastrophic threats. The courage required to continue intellectual work while surrounded by death and social collapse should not be underestimated, as it reflected a commitment to preserving human knowledge and culture that transcended immediate survival concerns. Women who took on expanded roles during the plague years, whether as business managers, healthcare providers, or community leaders, often demonstrated remarkable adaptability and competence under extremely difficult circumstances. Many of these women had to overcome not only the direct threats posed by plague, but also social prejudices and legal restrictions that limited their ability to act independently. Their success in managing complex responsibilities during the crisis helped establish precedents for expanded female participation in economic and social life that would influence gender relations for centuries to come. The children and young adults who survived the plague years often showed remarkable resilience in adapting to radically altered family and social circumstances. Orphaned children who had to learn to support themselves independently, young adults who inherited family businesses or properties before they had completed their training, and adolescents who took on adult responsibilities while still processing the trauma of losing parents and siblings, all demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of young people in the face of overwhelming challenges. The lessons of the plague years remain relevant today as we continue to face new epidemics and global health challenges. The importance of effective public health measures, the dangers of scapegoating and social division during times of crisis, and the need for accurate information and scientific understanding are as crucial now as they were 600 years ago. The plague reminds us that human civilization is always more fragile than we like to believe, but also that human beings possess remarkable capacities for adaptation, innovation, and mutual support when faced with existential threats. Modern epidemiologists and public health officials continue to study the plague years for insights into how diseases spread, how communities respond to health crises, and how social and economic factors influence epidemic outcomes. The detailed records maintained by some medieval cities provide valuable data for understanding long-term demographic trends and the relationship between population dynamics and social change. The quarantine systems developed during medieval plague outbreaks established principles that continue to influence modern disease control strategies. The economic lessons of the plague years are equally relevant for contemporary societies facing demographic transitions, labor shortages, and economic disruption.
The ways in which medieval communities adapted to sudden changes in population structure, labor availability, and economic relationships provide useful case studies for understanding how societies can manage major economic transitions. The plague years demonstrated both the dangers of economic systems that are too rigid to adapt to changing circumstances and the opportunities that can emerge from demographic and economic disruption. The social and political lessons of the plague years continue to inform discussions about governmental responsibility during public health crises, the balance between individual freedom and collective safety, and the importance of maintaining social solidarity during times of stress. The breakdown of traditional authority structures during plague outbreaks illustrated both the fragility of social institutions and the possibility of creating new forms of organization better adapted to changing circumstances. The memory of the plague has been preserved in countless ways throughout European culture, from the ghost stories and folk tales that warn of supernatural punishment for moral transgressions, to the great works of art and literature that explore themes of mortality, suffering, and redemption. These cultural artifacts serve as reminders of both the terrible price that can be exacted by epidemic disease and the extraordinary resilience of human creativity and hope even in the darkest of circumstances. Folk traditions throughout Europe preserve memories of the plague years in stories, songs, and customs that have been passed down through generations. Many of these traditions emphasize the importance of community solidarity, care for the vulnerable, and preparation for unexpected disasters. Traditional remedies and preventive practices, while often medically ineffective, reflect the accumulated wisdom of communities that had to learn how to cope with recurring epidemic threats using the limited resources available to them. The architectural legacy of the plague years can be seen in churches, hospitals, and other public buildings constructed during the recovery period, often featuring artistic and architectural elements that reflect the changed spiritual and aesthetic sensibilities of plague survivors. Many of these buildings incorporated improved ventilation systems, better sanitation facilities, and other design features that reflected hard-won knowledge about disease prevention and public health. The legal and institutional changes that emerged from the plague years continue to influence contemporary legal systems, governmental structures, and social policies. The expanded role of governmental authorities in public health, the development of emergency powers for dealing with social crises, and the recognition of collective responsibility for individual welfare all have their roots in innovations developed during the plague years. As we conclude this exploration of why people feared the plague, we must acknowledge that their fear was not irrational superstition, but a completely reasonable response to a genuine existential threat. The plague represented everything that medieval people found most terrifying about their world: the unpredictability of death, the powerlessness of human knowledge and technology, the apparent absence of divine protection, and the fragility of the social bonds that held their communities together. Yet, even in the face of this ultimate terror, human beings found ways to preserve what was most precious in their civilization and to build new forms of knowledge, art, and community that would serve future generations. The story of the plague is ultimately a story about the human capacity to endure, adapt, and eventually transcend even the most devastating challenges. While the immediate experience of living through plague outbreaks was undoubtedly horrific,
The long-term consequences included many positive developments that advanced human knowledge, expanded individual freedom, and created more flexible and resilient social institutions. The plague years remind us that even the most catastrophic events in human history can become sources of learning, growth, and renewal if we have the courage to face them honestly and the wisdom to learn from the experience. In the end, the story of the plague is not just about fear and death, but about the indomitable human spirit that somehow manages to find hope and meaning even in the face of overwhelming darkness. And with that thought, we close this chapter of history and wish you all good night.